All right, let's get into Module 3, Prologues and Genealogies, setting the stage for the Gospels. So what we're going to do now is we're actually going to begin to get into the biblical text by looking at a couple of things in this module. So we are going to look at Luke's prologue, we're going to look at John's prologue, we're going to look at Matthew's genealogy, and we're going to look at Luke's genealogy as well. So let's start just by comparing the prologues for a second. So by prologue, we basically mean these are how the gospel writers, Luke and John in particular, set up the beginning, the very first words of their gospel account. Luke, what he does is he writes his purpose or his intent for writing his gospel. So Luke's prologue is Luke 1 through 4, and that's where he states his purpose, a little bit of his methodology. John's prologue is John 1, verses 1 through 18, and this is very different than Luke's. His is really unpacking and introducing Christ as the pre-incarnate Christ. He's the one who has existed forever. So we'll look at that when we get to it as well. We are also in this module going to cover the genealogy. So there's two genealogies, Matthew's genealogy, which begins with Abraham and goes through the line of Joseph. This is what's known as Jesus' legal genealogy, Matthew 1 through 17. So we're going to look at Matthew's genealogy as well as Luke's genealogy. So Luke's genealogy goes from Luke 3, 23b through 38, and Luke covers what's traditionally thought of as Mary's line. Even though Mary isn't included in the genealogy, it is what's known as Jesus' natural line. So we have two prologues and we have two genealogies. So the way we're going to do this, as we had talked about in Module 1, is by using a harmony of the gospel. So here we see the outline or the table of contents from the harmony of the gospels, and you can see right there the two first items in the list are Luke's prologue and John's prologue. So we're going to cover those. And then we're also going to cover the following section on the lineage, right? Both genealogies. So Matthew 1 through 17 and Luke 3, 23b through verse 38. But before we do that, let's do a quick review of some of the key points we covered in our previous module 2, on how do we get the gospel. So we had talked about how there are 4 stages of development that the gospels went through. First, there was the events themselves, followed by the oral tradition, followed by the written sources, and then finally the gospel accounts. The events themselves, of course, led to the oral tradition, what was said and passed around through word of mouth. That eventually got written down and recorded, and the gospel is the organization of those written sources. We also had talked about with each of these stages of development of the gospels, there's a corresponding method of study. So historical Jesus research looks to understand about the historical facts. Form criticism wants to know the process of how the oral tradition was handled within the early church. Source criticism looks at the sources of the Gospels and their relationship to one another. And then redaction criticism looks at how exactly the process of putting the Gospels together went about. So we covered that at length in our previous module. But also we had talked about that one of the things that is most agreed upon, or generally agreed upon, was the fact that Mark was a source for the other 2 synoptic gospels. And the reasons for that, there's a number of reasons why what's called Markan priority, meaning that Mark was a source for Matthew and Luke. There's so much common material for all 3. There's a lot of verbal agreement in the way things are said. The sequencing or the order is similar. There's agreement in kind of asides and parenthetical comments. Kind of commentary on the text, that's similar, and there's similar alterations to Old Testament quotes. So there's a ton of nuanced similarities that make many scholars believe that Mark was a source for Matthew and Luke. And we'd also talked about one of the key things to remember is that 90% of Mark is found in either Matthew or Luke. So this is very significant for Mark being a primary source for Matthew and Luke. We'd also talked about that Mark wasn't the only source for these 2 Gospels. There was other ones. In fact, another one was that there's a large section of Matthew that is found in Luke, but it is not found in Mark. And this is what's traditionally known as Q. So we don't know what this source is, but obviously Matthew and Luke had another common source that was not Mark that they both used for their Gospels. But also Matthew had a third source that was not found in either Mark or Luke. So there's material that's only in Matthew, along with the material that is similar to the other two synoptic gospels. There's some that is also in Mark alone, and the same thing goes with Luke. He had a source that was not Matthew or was not Q. So again, I kind of unpacked all of that in our previous lesson, but that sets us up to now really begin to look at our next module, where we want to start to look at the first prologue of the gospel. So we're going to get into the gospel text in our next lesson as we talk about Luke's prologue, and that's going to be in Luke 1 through 4, as we unpack Luke's purpose for writing his gospel.